The October rain fell in sheets against the tall windows of the Ashford residence, each droplet tracing a path
This
down the
defiance
glass
ends now. You
that
will
seemed to
comply.
mirror the
Or
tears
what? You have
Nathaniel
no power
Ashford had
here.
stopped
Please, let's be
shedding exactly
reasonable.
10
Reason
years
is a
ago
luxury.
today. At 38, he sat in his study with the posture of a man who had learned to carry grief like a second skin, dignified, composed, but forever marked by loss. 10 years. A full decade had passed since the phone call that shattered
Sir,
his
the
world.
documents
The
you requested.
Massachusetts State Police.
Thank you. Please
an
leave them
icy
here.
highway.
Very good, sir.
A truck that couldn't stop. His wife, Elena, 8 months pregnant with their child gone in an instant, on her way to surprise him at the courthouse. The baby they had dreamed of welcoming, who never drew a single breath. Nate's dark hair, now touched with premature silver at the temples, caught the firelight as he reviewed case files for tomorrow's sentencing hearing. His blue eyes, once bright with the easy confidence of a young attorney who believed in justice and happy endings, had taken on the distant quality of a winter sky, beautiful in their clarity, but cold, reflecting a soul that had learned to function without warmth. The study around him was a monument to order and control. Law books lined the mahogany shelves in perfect alphabetical arrangement. His desk held nothing but necessary items positioned at precise right angles. The only personal touch was a single photograph face down in the bottom drawer that he hadn't looked at in 3 years. Looking meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking, and Nathaniel Ashford could not afford to break. He was a federal judge now, one of the youngest appointed to the District Court of Massachusetts. His opinions on sentencing reform had been cited by the Supreme Court twice. He presided over corruption trials, civil rights cases, matters that shaped the lives of thousands. He could not be the man who fell apart in his chambers because a defendant's pregnant wife sat in the gallery. So he had become someone else. The ice judge, they called him in the legal community. Always fair, always brilliant, always utterly without mercy for those who broke the social contract. Defense attorneys prepared their clients for the coldness they would encounter. Judge Ashford doesn't smile, they warned. He doesn't joke. He listens, he rules, and he moves on. Don't expect warmth. What they didn't know was that Nathaniel Ashford had forgotten how warmth felt. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his review of the sentencing guidelines. Morrison, his butler, and the only person who had known him before the accident, entered with the quiet dignity that had characterized their relationship for 20 years. Your Honor, Morrison said, using the formal address even in private, as if the title might protect them both from intimacy. The evening correspondence has arrived. There are several invitations requiring your attention. Nate accepted the silver tray without looking up from his files. Invitations were a necessary evil of his position: bar association dinners, legal society galas, charity functions where his presence and his checkbook were expected. He attended the minimum required, stayed the minimum acceptable time, and returned to the sanctuary of work and solitude. Decline them all, he said, his voice carrying the flat effect that had become his default. Send the usual donations where appropriate. Sir, Morrison's pause made Nate look up. The elderly butler's face showed something that might have been concern if Morrison ever allowed himself such familiarity. One of the invitations is from the Lowell Foundation. Mrs. Beatrice Lowell specifically requested your attendance at tomorrow evening's charity concert. The name stopped Nate's hand mid-motion over the files. Beatrice Lowell, Elena's mentor at the New England Conservatory, the woman who had taught his wife to play violin with such passion that music seemed to flow from her soul rather than her fingers. He hadn't spoken to Beatrice in 8 years, not since the funeral, when his grief had been too raw to face anyone who reminded him of what he'd lost. Mrs. Lowell noted in her letter, Morrison continued carefully, that the concert benefits the music therapy program at Boston Children's Hospital. She mentioned that Elena had planned to volunteer for the program before. He stopped the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like smoke. Before she died, before the accident, before Nate's world ended on a stretch of icy highway. Music therapy, Nate repeated the words, tasting strange in his mouth. He hadn't listened to music in 10 years. Couldn't bear it. Every note reminded him of Elena playing violin in their living room, her face luminous with joy, her hands bringing forth beauty that made him believe the world was fundamentally good. He had been wrong about that. The world was not good. It was random and cruel, and it took the best things and ground them to dust under the wheels of a truck whose driver had been texting his girlfriend. Sir, Morrison said, and now there was definitely emotion in his voice. In 20 years of service, I have never asked you for anything, but I'm asking now. Go to this concert. Honor Mrs. Lowell's invitation. She was important to Miss Elena. Nate wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at him to decline to stay in his fortress of work and routine, to avoid anything that might crack the careful shell he'd built around his heart. But Morrison's eyes held something that looked like desperate hope, and Nate owed this man more than he could ever repay. Morrison had been the one who identified Elena's body when Nate couldn't make his legs work. Morrison had planned the funeral when Nate had locked himself in this very study for 3 days. Morrison had quietly managed the household, the estate, the endless logistics of grief, asking nothing in return except that Nate survive. 1 hour, Nate heard himself say. I'll attend for 1 hour, no more. Morrison's relief was visible, though he quickly masked it behind professional composure. Of course, sir. I'll have your evening wear prepared. The concert begins at 7. After Morrison withdrew, Nate sat in the silence of his study and wondered what he had just agreed to. An hour of music, an hour of memories, an hour of feeling things he had spent a decade learning not to feel. He opened his bottom desk drawer and for the first time in 3 years, lifted out the photograph he kept there. Elena smiled at him from their wedding day violin, tucked under her chin, mid-laugh at something he'd said. She wore the antique lace dress his mother had worn, and her dark hair was crowned with small white roses. She looked impossibly young, impossibly alive, impossibly lost to him. I don't know if I can do this, he whispered to the photograph, his voice cracking on the words. I don't know if I can sit in a room full of music and not fall apart. The photograph offered no answer. Only Elena's frozen smile, a moment of joy, preserved in silver halide, while the woman herself had dissolved into ash in memory. Nate closed the drawer and returned to his case files, losing himself in the familiar comfort of legal analysis, where every problem had a precedent and every question had an answer that could be found in the annotated codes. But for the first time in years, he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept drifting to tomorrow evening, to the concert hall, to the music he would hear. Part of him hoped it would feel like nothing, that a decade of emotional numbness had insulated him completely. Part of him feared it would feel like everything, that the first notes would shatter his carefully constructed defenses and leave him exposed and raw. He didn't know which outcome frightened him more. The next evening arrived with the inevitability of a court date. Nate dressed in his formal wear with the mechanical precision of a man performing a legal ritual. Black suit, white shirt, silver cufflinks that had been his father's. Morrison had laid everything out with his usual attention to detail, and Nate appreciated the butler's discretion in not commenting on the significance of the evening. The drive to the Lowell Foundation Concert Hall took 20 minutes through Boston's autumn streets. Nate sat in the back of his town car, watching the city slide past the tinted windows. Couples walked hand in hand toward restaurants, families bundled against the October chill. The world continued its business of living, oblivious to the man in the car who had stopped participating a decade ago. The concert hall was housed in a restored Victorian building in Back Bay, all red brick and arched windows glowing with warm light. Nate had attended events here with Elena back when they were young attorneys full of idealism about changing the world through law. She had loved this neighborhood, loved the blend of old elegance and modern energy. He stepped from the car into the October evening and was immediately assaulted by memory. The smell of autumn leaves, the sound of laughter from the people streaming toward the entrance. The particular quality of twilight that he associated with Elena, suggesting they skip the symphony and get Thai food instead, her hand warm in his as they ran laughing through streets like these. Judge Ashford, Beatrice Lowell appeared at his elbow as if summoned by his thoughts. She was in her late 50s now, her dark hair gone gray, but her eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had made her one of Boston's most respected music educators. Nathaniel, thank you for coming. She embraced him before he could prepare himself for the contact, and for a moment Nate stiffened his body, unused to anything resembling affection. But Beatrice held on, and something in him cracked just enough to let him return the embrace awkwardly. Mrs. Lowell, he managed. It's been too long. Far too long. She stepped back, studying his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. You look exhausted, Nathaniel, like you haven't slept properly in a decade. I sleep fine. It was a lie. He managed 4 hours a night if he was lucky, his mind too busy cataloging everything that could go wrong to allow for rest. Of course you do. Beatrice's tone suggested she knew exactly how much he was lying. Come, let me show you to your seat. We have a very special performer tonight, someone I think you need to hear. She led him through the crowd, her hand light on his arm, navigating the sea of Boston's cultural elite with practiced ease. Nate recognized faces, fellow judges, attorneys, city officials, the well-heeled philanthropists who funded the arts. Several nodded to him in recognition. No one tried to engage him in conversation. His reputation for cold distance had its advantages. The concert hall itself was intimate, seating perhaps 200 people in curved rows facing a small stage. A grand piano stood waiting, its black surface reflecting the chandeliers above. Nate's seat was in the third row center, the best view of the stage and no easy escape route. Nathaniel, Beatrice said, still holding his arm, I want you to listen tonight. Really listen. Can you do that for me, for Elena's memory? He wanted to ask what she meant, but she was already moving away, taking her place at the podium to welcome the audience. Nate sank into his seat, surrounded by strangers, feeling more alone than he had in his empty study. The lights dimmed. Conversation faded to expectant silence. Beatrice's voice carried clearly in the acoustics of the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening for the Lowell Foundation's annual benefit concert. Your generous support makes it possible for us to bring music therapy to children facing illness, trauma, and loss. Music, as we know, has the power to heal wounds that medicine cannot touch, to speak to parts of the soul that words cannot reach. Nate felt something tighten in his chest. Healing, the soul. These were concepts he had locked away along with his capacity for joy. Tonight, Beatrice continued, we are privileged to hear from a remarkable young woman who embodies everything we believe about the transformative power of music. She came to Boston 3 months ago from Portland, Maine, to care for her ailing aunt, and in that time has been volunteering at the Children's Hospital, using her gift to bring comfort to families in their darkest hours. Please welcome Dr. Camille Rose Thorne. The applause was warm as a young woman walked onto the stage, and Nathaniel Ashford felt his carefully controlled world tilt on its axis. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense that Boston society typically celebrated. Her features were too strong, her presence too commanding for the delicate prettiness that was currently fashionable. She wore a simple dress of deep burgundy that brought out the richness of her chestnut hair, arranged in a style that was elegant but unpretentious. But it was her eyes that arrested him, brown and warm, scanning the audience with a combination of nervousness and genuine pleasure, as if she was grateful for the opportunity to share something precious. When she smiled at the assembled crowd, a natural, unaffected expression of delight, Nate felt something he had not felt in 10 years. A flutter in his chest, a catch in his breath, the faintest whisper of something that might in another life have been attraction. He crushed it immediately. That part of him was dead. He had buried it with Elena and their unborn child. Good evening, Camille said, her speaking voice carrying the same warm, rich quality that had characterized her smile. Thank you all for being here and for supporting such important work. Music therapy isn't just about playing pretty songs for sick children. It's about giving people a language when words fail. It's about creating a space where grief and joy can coexist, where pain can be acknowledged and transformed. She paused, her gaze sweeping the audience, and for one heart-stopping moment, her eyes met Nate's. He saw something flicker in her expression, surprise maybe, or recognition of something in his face that he didn't know was visible. Then she looked away, focusing on the piano accompanist who had taken his seat. I'd like to begin this evening with Handel's Lasciaci pianga from the opera Rinaldo. It's a lament about longing for freedom, about the weight of sorrow, but also about the possibility of transformation. I hope you'll find meaning in it. The pianist played the opening notes, a gentle cascade that seemed to ripple through the silence of the hall, and then Camille began to sing. The effect was immediate and devastating. Her voice rose clear and pure, filling the space with a sound that was somehow both technically perfect and emotionally raw. This was not the polished performance of a career soprano concerned with impressing critics. This was something more primal, more honest. This was a woman who understood the aria she was singing, who had felt the longing and sorrow embedded in every phrase. Nate sat frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the armrest until his knuckles turned white. The music washed over him like a wave, and for the first time in 10 years, he could not control his response to it. His carefully constructed walls, built brick by brick through a decade of discipline and denial, began to crack. The aria spoke of a soul imprisoned by sorrow, begging fate for mercy, for the chance to feel joy again. Camille sang it not as a historical piece, but as a living prayer, and Nate felt every word pierce through his defenses like arrows finding gaps in armor. He had not cried at Elena's funeral, had not cried when he scattered her ashes in the harbor she loved, had not cried through 3,650 days of waking up alone in a bed that had once held laughter and passion and plans for a future that would never arrive. But sitting in the third row of the Lowell Foundation concert hall, listening to a stranger sing an 18th century Italian aria, Nathaniel Ashford felt tears sliding down his face for the first time in a decade. He couldn't stop them, couldn't control the sob that wanted to rise in his throat, couldn't maintain the careful blankness that had become his public face. The music had found something in him that he thought was dead, some small ember of feeling that had survived 10 years of emotional winter, and now it was burning again, painful and bright and utterly beyond his control. When the aria ended, the silence in the hall was profound. Then applause erupted, genuine and moved. People were wiping their own eyes, touched by the raw beauty of what they had just heard. Nate didn't applaud. He couldn't. His hands were shaking too badly. He stared at Camille Thorne on the stage, this woman he had never met, this stranger who had somehow reached into his chest and restarted a heart he thought had stopped beating. She was looking at him again. Their eyes met across the rows of seats, and something passed between them, understanding perhaps, or recognition. She had seen his tears, had seen the breaking of something that had been too rigid for too long. And instead of looking away in embarrassment or pity, she held his gaze with a compassion so genuine it made his chest ache. Then she smiled at him. Not the bright public smile she had given the audience, but something smaller, sadder, more intimate. A smile that said, I see you, I see your pain. You're not alone. Nate felt something fundamental shift inside him. A door he had welded shut cracking open. A possibility he had renounced stirring back to life. For my second selection, Camille announced, returning her attention to the full audience. I'd like to perform a traditional folk song that has particular meaning for me. It's called The Water is Wide, and it speaks of love and loss of rivers too wide to cross, of the ways we break and somehow find the strength to continue. The piano began again, softer this time, and Camille's voice followed, weaving through the simple melody with such tenderness that Nate felt his defenses crumbling further. The water is wide, I cannot cross over, and neither have I wings to fly. Give me a boat that can carry two, and both shall row my love and I. The words cut through him like a blade. He and Elena had loved the water, had talked about buying a sailboat someday, had dreamed of teaching their child to swim in the harbor. All those plans, all those futures that would never happen, condensed into 4 lines of ancient poetry. But as Camille continued, the song shifted. It acknowledged the breaking of love, the withering of joy, but it also spoke of resilience, of endurance, of the human capacity to survive even the deepest losses. When she finished, Nate realized he was gripping the seat in front of him, his breathing ragged, his face wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. Around him, the audience was silent, caught in the spell of what they had just experienced. Beatrice returned to the podium as Camille left the stage to thunderous applause. But Nate barely heard the rest of the program. His mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened to him. For 10 years, he had been dead inside. Functioning, yes. Succeeding in his career, certainly. But not living, not feeling. Not allowing himself to be vulnerable to anything that might hurt him the way Elena's death had hurt him. In the span of 2 songs, this woman, this stranger with a voice like honey and heartbreak, had somehow reached through all his defenses and reminded him what it felt like to be human. To feel. To be moved by beauty instead of paralyzed by fear. He didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. When the formal concert concluded, the audience rose for a reception in the adjacent gallery. Nate stood automatically, his body moving while his mind struggled to catch up. He needed to leave. Needed to get back to the safety of his study, his case files, his carefully ordered existence. But Beatrice appeared at his side before he could escape. Nathaniel, she said quietly, taking his arm with gentle firmness. Come with me. There's someone I want you to meet. He wanted to refuse, wanted to run. But Beatrice had the same quality Elena had possessed, a certainty that made resistance feel churlish. So he allowed himself to be led through the crowd, his face carefully composed despite the emotional earthquake he had just experienced. Camille stood near the piano, surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations. She was gracious, but looked slightly overwhelmed, as if she wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention. When she saw Beatrice approaching with Nate, something flickered in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity about the man who had cried during her performance. Camille, dear, Beatrice said, I'd like you to meet federal judge Nathaniel Ashford. Nate, this is Dr. Camille Thorne, who I've been telling you about. Camille extended her hand and Nate took it automatically. Her grip was warm and firm, her palm slightly calloused in a way that suggested years of playing instruments. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, a sensation he hadn't felt in so long, he'd almost forgotten its name. Judge Ashford. Camille said, her voice carrying that same warmth he'd heard from the stage. I'm honored to meet you. The honor is mine, Dr. Thorne. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by emotion. Your performance this evening was extraordinary. Thank you. She studied his face with an openness that should have felt intrusive but somehow didn't. Beatrice told me you rarely attend concerts. I don't. He was aware of Beatrice watching them both with an expression that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Music has been difficult for me since my wife died. She was a violinist. He had no idea why he'd shared that. He never spoke of Elena to strangers, never offered personal information beyond what was absolutely necessary. But something about Camille's direct gaze made honesty feel easier than deflection. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Camille said, and the words carried none of the awkwardness that usually accompanied such condolences. Grief and music have a complicated relationship. Sometimes music makes the pain worse. Sometimes it's the only thing that makes it bearable. "Which is it for you?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Camille smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "Both. My mother died 5 years ago. For a long time, I couldn't sing at all. Every song reminded me of her absence. But eventually I realized that singing was how I kept her alive, how I honored what she gave me." Something in Nate's chest loosened at her words. She understood. This stranger understood the impossible paradox of loving something that hurt, of finding beauty in the very thing that reminded you of loss. "Your aria tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lascia ch'io pianga." You sang it like you knew exactly what those words meant. "I do." Camille's eyes met his with a directness that took his breath away. "I know what it feels like to be trapped in sorrow, to beg for the freedom to feel joy again. Music therapy taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry both the grief and the hope at the same time." "And is that possible?" The question came from somewhere deep from a part of him that had been silent for so long he'd forgotten it could speak. "Can you really carry both?" "I believe you can," Camille said softly. "I believe you have to. Otherwise we let loss take everything, not just what we've lost." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the reception fading around them. Two people connected by the shared language of grief and the possibility, however fragile, of something beyond it. "Dr. Thorne," Nate heard himself say. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner? Not tonight," he added quickly, seeing surprise flash across her face. "But perhaps later this week. I'd like to continue this conversation if you're willing." Camille's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "I'd like that very much, Judge Ashford." "Nate," he said, surprising himself again. "Please call me Nate." "Then you should call me Camille." Her hand was still in his, he realized. Neither of them had let go. "When did you have in mind?" "Saturday evening." He was moving on instinct now, following some impulse he didn't fully understand. "There's a symphony performance at Jordan Hall, Mozart's Requiem." "If music isn't too difficult—" "Music is never too difficult," Camille interrupted gently. "It's absence of music that's unbearable. Saturday would be perfect." They exchanged contact information with the careful formality of two people who sensed they were standing at the edge of something significant, but weren't quite ready to name it. When Camille was pulled away by other well-wishers, Nate found himself standing alone in the crowd, his hand still warm from where hers had been. Beatrice materialized at his side, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," Nate said quietly, "for inviting me, for introducing us." "Elena asked me to look after you," Beatrice replied. "In the hospital before the surgery, that didn't save her or the baby. She made me promise that if you ever seemed ready, I would help you find a way back to living. I've been waiting 10 years for you to be ready, Nathaniel. I think perhaps you finally are." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Elena had known she might die, had made provisions for his grief, had trusted her mentor to watch over him in her absence. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "I don't know if I can do this." "Camille Thorne is a remarkable young woman," Beatrice said. "Brilliant, compassionate, stronger than she looks. She's been through her own darkness and found her way to the other side. She's not Elena Nate, but she might be exactly who you need." As Nate drove home that night, the city lights blurring past his window, he replayed the evening in his mind. The music that had broken through his defenses, the woman whose voice had somehow reached places in his heart he thought were sealed forever. The conversation that had felt more real than any interaction he'd had in years. For the first time in a decade, Nathaniel Ashford went to sleep thinking about the future instead of the past. And for the first time in a decade, the thought didn't terrify him quite as much as it should have. He didn't know it yet, but the man who had forgotten how to live was about to remember. And it would begin, as all transformations do, with a single step into the unknown, a dinner date with a woman who sang like she understood the silence between notes, the space where grief and hope learned to coexist. The judge who never smiled was about to learn that healing isn't betrayal. It's the only way to honor what's been lost. And sometimes the silence between notes is where the most beautiful music begins. Saturday evening arrived with the weight of significance that Nathaniel Ashford had not experienced in a decade. He stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time, aware that his hands were trembling slightly. Morrison had laid out his charcoal suit with a burgundy tie that the butler claimed brought out the warmth in his eyes, a quality Nate had forgotten he possessed. "You look nervous, sir," Morrison observed from the doorway, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying something that looked dangerously like hope. "I'm not nervous," Nate lied, fumbling with the tie knot again. "It's simply been a long time since I've attended a social engagement that wasn't court-mandated." "Of course, sir. And might I say Dr. Thorne seems like a remarkable young woman, the kind of person who sees beyond surfaces to what truly matters." Nate met Morrison's gaze in the mirror. The butler had been with him through everything: the joy of his marriage to Elena, the devastation of her death, the long winter of grief that had followed. If anyone understood what this evening represented, it was Morrison. "I don't know what I'm doing," Nate admitted quietly. "I don't know how to be the person who goes on dates, who makes conversation about anything other than case law and sentencing guidelines. What if I've forgotten how to be human?" Morrison stepped into the room, his weathered hands gently taking over the tie, knotting it with practiced efficiency. "Sir, if I may speak plainly, you haven't forgotten how to be human. You've simply been protecting yourself from being hurt again. But Dr. Thorne's voice did something to you at that concert. I saw it in your face when you came home. You looked less like a ghost and more like a man." The words settled over Nate like a benediction. Morrison finished with the tie, stepping back and allowed himself a small smile. "You look distinguished, sir. Now go pick up that young lady and remember that it's perfectly acceptable to enjoy an evening. Miss Elena wouldn't have wanted you to live in darkness forever." The drive to Camille's apartment in Jamaica Plain took 25 minutes through Boston's Saturday evening traffic. Nate had offered to send a car for her, but she'd insisted on meeting him at her place, saying she wanted to walk the short distance to Jordan Hall together if the weather permitted. It was such a simple, normal suggestion that it had thrown him off balance. He'd forgotten that dating could be about shared experiences rather than orchestrated performances. Her building was a modest Victorian conversion in a neighborhood that still retained some of its bohemian character. Nate parked on the street and climbed the worn steps to the entrance, feeling absurdly like a teenager on a first date. His finger hesitated over the buzzer labeled Thorne 3B before he pressed it firmly. "Hello," Camille's voice came through the intercom, slightly distorted but warm. "Dr. Thorne, it's Nate. I'm a few minutes early. I can wait if—" "Come on up, third floor." The door buzzed open and Nate climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled faintly of cooking spices and old wood. Camille was waiting in her doorway when he reached the landing, and the sight of her made him forget whatever carefully prepared greeting he'd been planning. She wore a dress of deep emerald that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, her chestnut hair swept up in a style that was elegant but not overly formal. But it was her smile that arrested him, genuine and slightly nervous, as if she too was aware of the significance of this evening. "You look beautiful," Nate said, the words escaping before his judicial reserve could stop them. Camille's cheeks colored slightly. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself, Judge Ashford, though I have to say seeing you without the robes is somewhat disconcerting. I've only ever seen photos of you in official contexts. You looked me up." It wasn't a question. "Of course I did. You're a federal judge who cried during my handle aria. That's not exactly a common occurrence." She grabbed a light shawl from a hook by the door. "I read some of your sentencing opinions. The one about restorative justice for juvenile offenders was particularly moving." Nate felt something warm unfurl in his chest. She'd done her research, but not just the surface biographical facts. She'd read his work, the place where he still allowed himself to feel, to advocate for change, to believe that broken things could sometimes be repaired. "I didn't realize my judicial opinions were available for casual reading," he said as they descended the stairs together. "The law library at Boston University has a collection. I may have spent a few hours there this week." "Why?" Camille glanced at him with a combination of directness and vulnerability that he was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "I wanted to understand who you are beyond the man who came to my concert. Your writing is brilliant, Nate. Compassionate but rigorous. You write like someone who understands that justice and mercy are not opposites." "That's a kind interpretation. Some of my colleagues would say I'm too soft." "Those colleagues probably haven't experienced what it's like to need mercy," Camille said as they emerged onto the street. The October evening was cool but pleasant, the air carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant wood smoke. "Shall we walk? It's only about 15 minutes to Jordan Hall." They fell into step together, navigating the sidewalks of Jamaica Plain as the neighborhood settled into evening. Nate found himself hyper-aware of her presence beside him, the subtle scent of her perfume, the rhythm of her footsteps matching his, the way passers-by smiled at them as if they were simply a normal couple out for a normal evening. "Tell me about music therapy," he said, genuinely curious. "What drew you to it?" Camille was quiet for a moment, as if organizing her thoughts. "My mother had cancer, ovarian stage 4 by the time they found it. The treatments were brutal chemoradiation surgeries that bought her months but not years. She was in so much pain and the medications made her foggy, disconnected from herself. But music cut through all of that." She paused at a crosswalk, her eyes distant with memory. "I'd sit with her and sing. Old songs from her childhood, hymns from church, even silly pop songs from when I was a teenager. And for those minutes while I was singing, she'd come back. Her eyes would clear, she'd squeeze my hand in rhythm. Sometimes she'd even harmonize. Music gave her a way to be herself when everything else was taking that away." "I'm sorry you lost her," Nate said quietly. "I'm sorry I wasted so much time being angry instead of present," Camille replied. "I was finishing my doctorate, teaching, so busy with my own life that I didn't visit as often as I should have. When she died, I had all these regrets about conversations we didn't have, experiences we didn't share. That's when I realized that music therapy wasn't just about helping other people. It was about forgiving myself." The honesty of her confession struck Nate like a physical blow. Here was someone who understood guilt, who carried her own weight of what-ifs and should-haves. He'd thought he was alone in that particular hell. "I killed my wife," he heard himself say. The words came from somewhere deep and unexpected, a truth he'd never spoken aloud. "Not literally, but I might as well have. She died on her way to surprise me at the courthouse. If I hadn't been so obsessed with that trial, if I'd just come home when she asked if I'd postponed the hearing like she wanted." "Stop." Camille's hand found his arm, gentle but firm, bringing them both to a halt on the sidewalk. "I don't know all the details, but I know guilt. And I know that it's a story we tell ourselves to make random tragedy feel like something we could have controlled. Your wife made a choice to get in that car. The weather made a choice to ice the roads. The other driver made a choice that led to the accident. You didn't make any of those choices, Nate. You're not God." It was almost exactly what she'd said in her performance, that healing meant acknowledging what you couldn't control. But hearing it directed at him, spoken with such gentle certainty, made it feel newly possible. "A grief counselor told me something similar," Nate admitted. "I stopped seeing her because I didn't want to hear it. Because as long as it's your fault, you can punish yourself instead of accepting that the universe is random and terrible things happen to good people for no reason at all." Camille's eyes met his with understanding that went bone deep. "I know that trick, Nate. I've played that game. It's safer to blame ourselves than to face the truth that we're not in control of nearly as much as we think we are." They resumed walking, but something had shifted between them. The careful politeness of a first date had given way to something rawer, more real. Two people who'd survived their own private hells recognizing each other across the distance. Jordan Hall emerged before them, its Romanesque revival architecture glowing in the evening light. The New England Conservatory's premier concert venue had been one of Elena's favorite places. Nate felt the familiar tightness in his chest as they climbed the steps, but Camille's presence beside him somehow made it bearable. Inside the hall was already filling with the pre-concert crowd music, students, faculty, Boston's classical music enthusiasts. Nate had secured excellent seats in the orchestra section, fifth row center. As they settled in, Camille studied the program with evident interest. "Mozart's Requiem," she said softly. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" "It's one of the most emotionally intense pieces in the repertoire." "I'm not sure of anything," Nate admitted, "but I want to try. Your performance at the Lowell Foundation, it reminded me that music used to bring me joy. I'd like to see if I can find that again." "Well, you picked an ambitious piece for your re-entry into the world of music." Camille's smile was gentle. "The Requiem is all about death and judgment and the hope of eternal rest. Mozart was dying when he wrote it, trying to make sense of his own mortality." "Cheerful stuff." "Actually, yes, because underneath all the darkness, it's ultimately about mercy, about the possibility of redemption and peace. That's why it's so powerful. It doesn't deny the reality of death, but it refuses to let death have the final word." Before Nate could respond, the lights dimmed. The orchestra filed in, followed by the chorus and finally the conductor. The audience settled into expectant silence. The Requiem began with the opening introit, the chorus's voices rising in solemn supplication. Nate felt the familiar clench of emotion, but forced himself to breathe through it, to stay present. With him, Camille was utterly absorbed, her face reflecting the music's shifting moods. As the performance progressed through the Dies Irae's apocalyptic fury, the Recordare's gentle plea for mercy, and the Lacrimosa's weeping beauty, Nate found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt in years, the ability to be moved by art without being destroyed by it. The music was sad, yes, but it was also transcendent. It acknowledged suffering while reaching towards something beyond suffering. During the Lacrimosa, he felt Camille's hand find his in the darkness between their seats. Her fingers interlaced with his naturally, as if they'd been holding hands for years rather than minutes. The contact grounded him, reminded him that he wasn't alone in this cathedral of sound and emotion. When the final communion's Lux Eterna faded into silence, requesting eternal light for the departed, Nate sat in the darkness with tears on his face and Camille's hand warm in his. But these tears felt different from the ones he'd cried at her concert. These were tears of release rather than breaking open. These were tears that acknowledged loss while accepting that life continued. The applause was reverent, appreciative. As the lights came up, Camille gently squeezed his hand before releasing it. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "I think so." Nate wiped his face self-consciously. "That was devastating and beautiful, and thank you for being here, for not thinking I'm insane for choosing a requiem as date music." Camille's laugh was soft and genuine. "Nate, I'm a music therapist who works with grieving families. If you'd taken me to see something cheerful and superficial, I would have been disappointed. This was perfect." They joined the crowd flowing out of the hall into the cool October night. Nate realized he wasn't ready for the evening to end, wasn't ready to return to the silence of his empty house. "There's a cafe near here," he said. "Nothing fancy, but they serve good coffee and stay open late. Would you like to continue this conversation somewhere less funereal?" "I'd love that." The cafe was a small place tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, the kind of establishment that Boston excelled at: worn wooden tables, mismatched chairs, the smell of coffee, and old books. They found a corner table away from the handful of other patrons, mostly students, hunched over laptops. Nate ordered black coffee. Camille got chamomile tea and a slice of lemon cake that she insisted they share. The simple domesticity of it, two people sharing dessert over hot drinks, felt both foreign and achingly familiar. "Can I ask you something?" Camille said, her spoon tracing patterns in the sugar she'd added to her tea. "What made you finally accept Beatrice's invitation to the concert? She told me she'd been trying to get you to attend events for years." Nate considered the question, wanting to give her an honest answer. "It was the anniversary, 10 years to the day since Elena died. Morrison, my butler, he's really more family than staff. He looked at me that morning and I could see he was worried. Not about my safety or anything dramatic. Just worried that I was disappearing into this person who only exists on paper. The ICE judge who decides cases and signs orders and goes through the motions of living without actually being alive." He took a sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts. "I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something just because I wanted to. Everything was obligation or routine or professional necessity. The idea of choosing to attend a concert, of voluntarily exposing myself to music and emotion, and the possibility of feeling something, it terrified me. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was spending another 10 years as a ghost in my own life." "So you came to my concert as an act of courage," Camille said softly. "Or desperation? I'm not sure there's much difference." "There's no difference at all. Courage is just desperation that's decided to try anyway." She cut into the lemon cake, offering him the first bite on her fork. The gesture was intimate without being presumptuous, and Nate found himself accepting it. The cake was tart and sweet, perfectly balanced. Like this entire evening, the bitter and the beautiful intertwined. "Your turn," Nate said. "Why music therapy? You could have been a performer. Beatrice clearly thinks you have the talent for it." Camille set down her fork, her expression thoughtful. "Because performing is about the performer's skill, their interpretation, their emotional truth. Music therapy is about meeting people where they are, using sound to create a bridge to places they can't reach with words alone. When my mother was dying, I didn't sing for her because I was good at it. I sang because it was the only language that could carry what I needed to say." She paused, her fingers wrapped around her teacup as if seeking its warmth. "After she died, I tried going back to performance. I auditioned for opera companies, did some recital work, but it felt hollow. I was technically proficient, but emotionally disconnected. Then I volunteered at a hospice, singing for patients in their final days. And something clicked. This wasn't about me and my voice. It was about using music as a tool for healing, for connection, for helping people process things too big for ordinary conversation." "Do you miss performing?" Nate asked. Sometimes. But what I do now feels more important. Last week, I worked with a 7-year-old boy whose father died in a construction accident. He hadn't spoken since it happened and not a word in 6 weeks. We spent an hour together just making sounds, drumming, humming, playing xylophones. By the end of the session, he whispered, "I miss my daddy." 4 words. But they were the 4 words his mother had been praying to hear. Nate felt something shift in his chest. Here was someone who understood that healing wasn't about forgetting or moving on. It was about finding a language for the unspeakable. "That's remarkable work," he said quietly. "I see something similar in courts sometimes. Victims who can't articulate what was done to them. Defendants who can't explain the circumstances that led to their crimes. We use legal language to create structure, but sometimes the law isn't equipped to hold the full truth of human experience." "Which is why your opinions are so powerful," Camille said. "You write about the law, but between the lines you're writing about mercy and second chances and the possibility that broken things can be repaired. That's music therapy with legal citations." The comparison surprised a laugh out of him, a sound so unexpected that Nate almost didn't recognize it as coming from his own throat. When was the last time he'd laughed, really laughed, not the polite acknowledgement of humor that professional situations required? Camille's face lit up at the sound, her smile radiant. "There it is. I was wondering if you knew how." "I'd forgotten," Nate admitted. Laughter felt like betrayal. Like I didn't have the right to feel joy when Elena and our baby didn't get to feel anything at all. "Can I tell you what I've learned from working with grieving families?" Camilla leaned forward, her eyes intense. "The dead don't want us to stop living. They want us to honor their memory by experiencing all the bond and beauty and love they can't access anymore. Your wife, your child, they would want you to laugh, Nate. They would want you to have evenings like this to feel connection and possibility and hope. Grief that turns into permanent shutdown isn't tribute, it's waste." The words should have felt like an accusation, but they didn't. They felt like permission, like someone had finally given him the authorization to exist as something other than a monument to loss. "Elena left me a letter," Nate heard himself say. "The hospital gave it to me after she died. She wrote it during her pregnancy as a precaution in case something went wrong. I've never opened it. It's been sitting in my desk drawer for 10 years and I can't bring myself to break the seal." "Why not?" "Because once I read it, that's it. That's the last communication I'll ever have from her. As long as the envelope is sealed, there's still something left. Some final piece of her that I haven't consumed." Camille was quiet for a long moment, her tea forgotten. "Or," she said softly, "maybe you're afraid of what she wrote. Maybe you're afraid she'll give you permission to move forward, and then you won't have the excuse of grief to protect you from the risk of living fully again." The observation hit like a physical blow so accurate it took Nate's breath away. She was right. He'd been hiding behind his mourning, using it as armor against any possibility that might hurt him, the way Elena's death had hurt him. "You're very perceptive for someone I just met," he managed. "I'm very familiar with the stories we tell ourselves to avoid uncomfortable truths," Camille corrected gently. "I did the same thing after my mother died. Threw myself into my doctorate, worked 18-hour days, filled every moment with productivity so I wouldn't have to sit still and feel the enormity of what I'd lost. It wasn't until I collapsed from exhaustion and ended up in the hospital that I realized I was running from grief instead of processing it." "What changed?" "My father sat by my hospital bed and asked me one question. 'Is this what your mother would have wanted for you?' And I realized the answer was no. She would have wanted me to cry to rage, to feel all of it, and then to choose life anyway. Not the half-life I was living where I was physically present but emotionally absent. Real life with all its risks and possibilities." Nate reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture feeling both natural and terrifying. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for your honesty, for not treating me like I'm fragile or damaged beyond repair." "You're not fragile, Nate. You're grieving. There's a difference." Camille's fingers tightened around his. "And I'm not treating you any particular way. I'm just being myself with you because you've been yourself with me. That's rare enough to be precious." They sat in the warm cafe, hands linked across the table, while Boston's Saturday night carried on around them. Students debated philosophy at nearby tables. An elderly couple shared a pot of tea in comfortable silence. The barista hummed along to the jazz playing softly from invisible speakers. This was what normal looked like, Nate realized. This simple act of connecting with another person over coffee and conversation. He'd forgotten it was possible. "I should probably take you home," he said reluctantly as the cafe began preparing to close. "Though I'm not ready for this evening to end." Then let's walk, Camille suggested. The long way. Tell me about your work, about the cases that matter to you, about what keeps you up at night, besides grief. They paid and stepped back out into the October darkness. The temperature had dropped and Camille shivered slightly. Without thinking, Nate shrugged out of his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was so automatic, so much like something the old Nate would have done, that it surprised them both. Thank you, Camille said, pulling the jacket close. It dwarfed her, and something about seeing her wrapped in his clothing made Nate's chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't ready to name. They walked through the cooling night, and Nate found himself talking about his work in a way he never had before. Not the dry recitation of cases and precedents, but the human stories beneath the legal issues. The single mother he'd sentenced to drug treatment instead of prison, who'd written him a letter 3 years later with a photo of her nursing degree. The teenage boy he'd given a second chance to, who was now studying engineering at MIT. The domestic violence victim he'd protected with a restraining order that her ex-husband had violated, leading to a contempt citation that finally got the man off the streets. You care, Camille said wonderingly. Behind all that judicial reserve and professional distance, you actually care deeply about the people whose lives you touch. Caring doesn't always help, Nate said. Sometimes the law ties my hands. Sometimes the best outcome I can manage is still terrible for everyone involved. But you try, that matters. They had reached her building without Nate quite registering how far they'd walked. He didn't want to say goodnight, didn't want to return to his empty house and the silence that would feel even more profound now that he'd experienced this connection. Nate, Camille said, still wrapped in his jacket, looking up at him in the glow of the streetlight. I had a wonderful time tonight. Thank you for sharing the requiem with me, for the conversation, for trusting me with your truth. I'm the one who should be thanking you, Nate said, for seeing past the ice judge to whoever I used to be, for reminding me that it's possible to feel things without falling apart. Can I see you again? The question was direct, vulnerable. Not as therapist and client, not as casual acquaintances, but as two people who might be building something worth exploring. Nate's heart hammered in his chest. This was the moment, the choice between stepping forward into uncertainty or retreating into the safety of solitude. Every instinct screamed at him to protect himself, to avoid the risk of loss that came with attachment. But he thought of Elena's letter still sealed in his desk. He thought of Morrison's worried eyes. He thought of the 7-year-old boy who'd finally found the words to say, I miss my daddy, and the courage it must have taken to speak that truth aloud. Yes, Nate said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff. I would like that very much. I don't know what I'm doing, Camille. I haven't dated in 12 years, and even then I was terrible at it. I'm going to make mistakes and probably say the wrong things, and Camille stepped forward and kissed him. Not passionately, but gently, sweetly, a brief pressure of her lips against his that tasted like chamomile tea and possibility. When she pulled back, Nate was staring at her in shock. Sorry, she said, not sounding sorry at all. You were spiraling, and sometimes the best way to interrupt an anxiety loop is to change the stimulus. Is that what they teach in Ozic therapy training? No, that's what they teach in Being a Human Who Likes Another Human training. Camille smiled, her hand coming up to rest against his chest right over his heart. I like you, Nate Ashford, the serious judge who cries at concerts, the brilliant legal mind who writes about mercy, the grieving widower who's brave enough to try again. All of it, all of you. I like you too. Nate managed, his voice rough with emotion. More than I thought I was still capable of liking anyone. Then let's take this one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations beyond honesty and kindness. We'll figure out the rest as we go. She slipped his jacket off and handed it back to him, her fingers lingering on his for just a moment longer than necessary. Call me tomorrow. I'd like to hear your voice when I'm not performing or being profound over coffee. Tomorrow, Nate promised. And Camille, thank you for tonight, for everything. He waited until she was safely inside before returning to his car. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and late-night traffic. When he arrived at the Ashford residence, Morrison was waiting despite the late hour. How was your evening, sir? The butler asked, taking Nate's jacket with a knowing look. Morrison, sir, Nate said, feeling a smile tug at his lips, an expression so unfamiliar it felt like wearing someone else's face. I think I might be in trouble. The very best kind of trouble, I hope, sir. The very best kind, Nate agreed. That night, for the first time in 10 years, Nathaniel Ashford fell asleep thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what he might be finding. And in his dreams, Elena smiled at him from some distant shore, her violin tucked under her chin, playing a melody that sounded like blessing and release. and permission to love again. The ice was thawing, and it turned out that warmth, when you'd been frozen long enough, felt like coming home. November arrived in Boston with the kind of cold clarity that made everything sharp-edged and vivid. Nathaniel Ashford stood at his chamber's window, watching the first snowflakes of the season drift past the glass, and realized with a start that he was humming. Actually humming a fragment of Mozart's Requiem that had been running through his head since Saturday night. It had been 4 weeks since his first date with Camille, and in that time something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of his life. They'd seen each other 9 times coffee meetings that stretched into long walks, a museum visit where they debated the ethics of art repatriation, a quiet dinner at a Vietnamese restaurant where Camille had taught him how to properly hold chopsticks while laughing at his fumbling attempts. Each encounter had felt like carefully removing another brick from the wall he had built around himself. Not tearing it down, that would have been too violent, too sudden, but dismantling it piece by piece, discovering that the world beyond his self-imposed isolation was not as terrifying as he'd feared. His phone buzzed with a text. Camille's name appeared on the screen, and Nate felt that now familiar flutter in his chest, working with a patient at Children's Hospital until 4. Coffee after I have something I need to tell you. The phrase "I need to tell you" sent a spike of anxiety through him. In his experience, those words rarely preceded good news. But he pushed the fear down and typed back, "My chambers, 4:30. I'll have Morrison bring actual good coffee, not the courthouse sludge." 3 dots appeared then. Perfect. See you then. And Nate, don't worry, it's not bad news, just important. He tried to focus on the sentencing memorandum he was drafting, but his mind kept circling back to Camille's message. What could be so important it couldn't wait until their planned dinner tomorrow? Had she decided this was moving too fast? That getting involved with an emotionally damaged federal judge was more than she'd bargained for? By 4:15, Nate had given up any pretense of productivity. He'd straightened his desk 3 times, repositioned the chairs in his chambers twice, and was considering whether to take off his judicial robes when Morrison knocked and entered. "Dr. Thorne is here, sir," the butler said, his eyes twinkling with amusement at Nate's obvious nervousness. "And if I may say so, you might want to breathe. You look like a man awaiting a jury verdict." "Thank you, Morrison. That's very helpful." "Always happy to serve, sir." Camille entered, bringing with her the scent of cold air, in something floral, jasmine perhaps, or honeysuckle. She wore jeans and a cream-colored sweater under her coat, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 29 years. But it was her expression that caught Nate's attention, excited and nervous and determined all at once. "Hi," she said, accepting the coffee Morrison poured before tactfully withdrawing. "Thanks for seeing me on short notice." "Of course. You said it was important." Nate gestured to the sitting area of his chambers, away from the desk and its associations with legal authority. They settled into facing chairs, and he forced himself to wait for her to speak first. Camille took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I got a call this morning from Genevieve Lancaster. Do you know her?" The name hit Nate like a physical blow. Genevieve. He struggled to find the right word. Lover, girlfriend. The relationship had been brief and years ago before Elena, but Genevieve had never quite accepted that it was over. She'd appeared at Elena's funeral, offering condolences that felt proprietary. She'd called him periodically over the past decade, suggesting dinner or drinks, always with the implicit offer of something more. "I know her," Nate said carefully. "We were involved a long time ago, before I met Elena." "Why is she calling you?" "Because she's the federal prosecutor handling a case that intersects with my work at the Children's Hospital. A doctor who's being investigated for insurance fraud related to pediatric treatments." Camille set down her coffee cup, her hands folding in her lap with the kind of careful control that suggested she was working hard to stay calm. She was very friendly, very interested in my background, my work, how long I'd been in Boston. And then she asked how I knew you, very casually, oh, by the way. When I told her we'd been seeing each other, her whole demeanor changed. She got cold, professional. She said she wanted to make sure I understood who you were, a federal judge with a reputation for uncompromising standards. She implied that getting involved with you would put me under scrutiny, that people would assume I was trying to gain some advantage for my therapy practice. Rage, white hot and immediate, flared in Nate's chest. How dare Genevieve try to intimidate Camille? How dare she use her position as a prosecutor to interfere in his personal life? "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. She's had difficulty accepting that I'm not interested in resuming our relationship, but using her office to harass you is completely inappropriate. I'll file a formal complaint with the U.S. Attorney's Office." "Nate, Both Camille's hand found his, her touch grounding. I'm not telling you this because I'm scared or because I want you to fix it. I'm telling you because we need to be honest with each other about what we're walking into. If we're going to continue seeing each other, and I very much want to continue, then I need to know, is this going to be a pattern? Will there be other people who see me as a threat or an interloper? The question deserved an honest answer. Nate thought about his world, the legal community, the social circles that overlapped with federal judiciary, the professional networks where Elena had been a known and beloved figure. Yes, he said quietly, there will be people who resent you for not being Elena. People who think I should remain a widower out of some misguided sense of romantic tragedy. People like Genevieve, who wanted me for themselves and see you as competition. Boston's legal and cultural communities are smaller than they look, and gossip travels fast. Okay, Camille absorbed this with remarkable calm. So we need a strategy. We need to be prepared for the fact that our relationship, if that's what this is becoming, will be public and scrutinized. Is that what this is becoming? Nate asked, his heart hammering. A relationship. Camille smiled, and the warmth in her expression eased some of his anxiety. I don't generally kiss men I'm not interested in having a relationship with, Nate. And I don't spend my evenings researching federal sentencing guidelines just to make conversation. So yes, I think we're building towards something. The question is whether you're ready for what that means. Was he ready? Nate looked at this remarkable woman who'd walked into his life barely a month ago and somehow managed to wake up parts of himself he'd thought permanently dormant. She was asking him to choose between the safe isolation he'd maintained for a decade and the risky, messy, potentially devastating experience of opening his heart again. I'm terrified, he admitted. Every instinct I have says this is dangerous, that caring about you means giving you the power to destroy me the way losing Elena destroyed me. But Camille, when I'm with you, I remember what it felt like to be alive. And I think I'm more frightened of spending the rest of my life as a ghost than I am of getting hurt. Then we're partners in this, Camille said firmly. We face whatever comes together as equals. We don't hide from people like Genevieve, but we also don't let them dictate our choices. Agreed. Agreed. Nate brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that surprised them both. Though I am going to file that complaint. Using prosecutorial authority to intimidate someone, it is a firing offense, and Genevieve needs to understand that boundaries exist for a reason. My fierce protector, Camille teased gently. Just remember that I can fight my own battles. I've dealt with difficult people before. Hospital administrators who think music therapy is frivolous. Insurance companies that won't cover sessions. Family members who blame me when their loved ones don't magically get better. I'm tougher than I look. No, I'm learning that, Nate said, though it doesn't stop me from wanting to shield you from anything unpleasant. That's sweet but not sustainable. We protect each other, Nate, but we don't infantilize each other. I need to know you see me as a partner, not a project or someone who needs saving. The words echoed something Elena had said to him once early in their marriage, when he'd been particularly overbearing about a case she was working on. I married you because I wanted a partner, not a guardian, she told him. Trust me to handle my own battles, and I'll trust you to handle yours. That's what equals do. He'd failed at that with Elena toward the end, had been so focused on his work, so convinced his trial was the most important thing in the world, that he'd missed her fear about driving in the snow, her request that he just come home instead of making her travel to him. I see you as a partner, he said to Camille now, meaning it with everything in him. An equal, someone who challenges me to be better while accepting me as I am. I won't make the mistake of taking you for granted. Good. Camille stood, drawing him up with her. Now I have a favor to ask. There's a hospital benefit gala next month. It's one of those rubber chicken charity dinners where doctors and administrators make speeches and everyone pretends the food is edible. I was planning to skip it, but if we're doing this, if we're being public about whatever this is, then maybe we should go together. As a couple, let Boston's medical and legal communities see that we're not hiding. The suggestion was both terrifying and exactly right. A public debut, a statement that Nathaniel Ashford was no longer the untouchable ice judge frozen in permanent mourning. I'll need to check my calendar, he said, then caught her knowing look and amended. I'll make sure my calendar is clear. When is it? December 15th, black tie. Probably excruciatingly boring, but at least we'll be excruciatingly bored together. I can't think of anyone I'd rather be bored with. They stood close in his chambers, the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and Nate marveled at how natural this felt. How being with Camille didn't feel like betraying Elena's memory, but like honoring it, choosing to live fully the way Elena would have wanted. I should go, Camille said reluctantly. I have evening sessions with 2 patients. But Nate, thank you for not freaking out about Genevieve, for hearing me as a partner instead of seeing me as a problem to solve. Thank you for trusting me with the truth instead of deciding it was too complicated. After she left, Nate sat in the quiet of his chambers and did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He pulled open his bottom desk drawer, reached past the face-down photograph of Elena, and retrieved a sealed envelope that had been sitting untouched for a decade. His name was written on the front in Elena's handwriting, the distinctive backslant she'd developed from years of holding a violin. To Nate, to be read when you're ready. All my love, E. His hands trembled as he held the envelope. Camille had been right. He'd been afraid of what Elena had written, afraid of the permission he suspected the letter would give him. With a deep breath, Nate broke the seal. My dearest Nate, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong with the pregnancy or the delivery, and I'm not there to say these things to you in person. I'm writing this in the hospital, waiting for them to take me in for the emergency surgery, and I'm scared, but I'm also clear about what I need to tell you. First, I love you. I have loved you since the day you argued with me about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony at that terrible law school party, insisting that the Ode to Joy was overrated. You were wrong, by the way, but I loved your passion and your willingness to take an unpopular position. I love your brilliant legal mind and your terrible cooking and the way you cry during sentimental commercials. I love all of you, and whatever happens in that operating room, that love is permanent and real and the best thing I ever did. Second, if I don't make it and you're reading this months or years later, I need you to know that what happened is not your fault. You're probably blaming yourself for something not being there, working too hard. Some choice you made that in retrospect seems significant. Stop it. Life is random and terrible and beautiful, and sometimes we don't get the endings we planned. That's not failure. That's just being human. Third, and this is the most important part, I need you to promise me you'll live. Really live, Nate, not just exist. I know you'll grieve. I would be hurt if you didn't, but don't let grief become your identity. Don't spend the rest of your life as a monument to what we lost. I want you to laugh again, to fall in love again, to find someone who makes you as happy as I hope I made you. I know how your mind works. You're probably thinking that loving someone new would dishonor my memory. But Nate, the opposite is true. The best way to honor what we had is to prove that love is worth the risk of loss. That knowing someone deeply, even if you lose them, is better than never knowing them at all. If I taught you anything about love, I hope it was that. Find someone, Nate, someone kind and strong and capable of calling you on your bullshit. Someone who challenges you intellectually and supports you emotionally. Someone who understands that you come with a history and loves you, not despite it, but because it's part of who you are. Don't settle for less than everything we had, but don't deny yourself the possibility of everything you could have. And when you find that person, because you will, stubborn, brilliant, beautiful man, don't feel guilty about loving them. Love them completely. Love them the way you loved me, with your whole heart and no reservations. That's not betrayal. That's the legacy I want to leave. I'm being called into surgery now. Our baby is waiting to meet us, and I'm going to fight like hell to be there for all of it, the first breath, the first word, the first heartbreak. But if I'm not, I need to know you'll teach our child about me. Tell them their mother was a mediocre violinist with an excellent heart. Tell them she loved their father more than music, which for a musician is saying something. Tell them she believed that beauty and love are the only things that matter in the end. Live, Nate, please live. All my love forever, Elena. P.S. If you're reading this and you're still alone, if you haven't let anyone in, then I'm haunting you. I swear to God, I will figure out how to rattle chains and make the lights flicker until you get your act together. Don't test me on this. Nate read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face, Elena's words washing over him like absolution. She'd known him so well, had anticipated his guilt, his self-imposed isolation, his tendency to turn grief into penance. And she'd given him permission, no more than permission. She'd commanded him to live to love again, to honor their marriage by proving that love was worth the inevitable risk of loss. He thought about Camille, about her warmth and intelligence, and the way she saw through his defenses to the man underneath. About how she'd walked into his life like music breaking through silence, unexpected and transformative. Elena would have liked her, he realized, would have appreciated her directness, her refusal to treat him as fragile, her insistence on partnership rather than rescue. Maybe that's what Beatrice had seen, what had prompted her to make sure Nate and Camille met. Not just compatibility, but the kind of strength Nate needed in a partner. He carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. But this time, instead of hiding it in his desk drawer, he put it in his briefcase. He wanted to show it to Camille not tonight, but soon. Wanted her to know that Elena herself had blessed whatever they were building together. His phone rang. Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "Sir Justice Edmund Ashford is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Nate's father, the retired Supreme Court justice whose expectations had shaped Nate's entire life. They hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since their last tense dinner, where Edmund had criticized Nate's sentencing decisions as too lenient. "Send him in, Morrison." Justice Edmund Ashford entered the chambers with the commanding presence that had intimidated attorneys for 4 decades on the bench. At 68, he was still formidable and silver-haired, ramrod straight, dressed impeccably in a three-piece suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Nathaniel." His father's voice carried the dry precision of a man who measured every word. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. Please sit." Edmund took the chair Camille had occupied minutes earlier, and Nate wondered if his father could sense the shift in the room's emotional temperature, the lingering warmth of connection that hadn't existed before Camille entered his life. "I'll come straight to the point," Edmund said. "I've been hearing things, rumors about you and some music therapist, that you've been seen together publicly, that you're—" He paused as if the word pained him. "Dating." "Her name is Dr. Camille Rose Thorne," Nate said quietly. "And yes, we're seeing each other." "Nathaniel." Edmund's sigh carried the weight of profound disappointment. "It's been 10 years since Elena died. 10 years of exemplary mourning, of dedication to your career and your reputation. Don't throw that away for some inappropriate relationship with a woman barely out of graduate school. She's 29 years old, Father. Hardly a child. And I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing to live again. You're a federal judge. Your personal life isn't personal. It's public record, subject to scrutiny and interpretation. Getting involved with someone so far outside our professional and social circles raises questions about your judgment." Nate felt anger kindle in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Questions from whom? From you, from the legal establishment that thinks widowers should remain permanently celibate out of some Victorian sense of propriety. From everyone who expects you to maintain the dignity befitting your position." Edmund leaned forward, his expression stern. "Elena was perfect for you, brilliant, accomplished, from a family that understood our world. This therapist, however talented she may be at her little music sessions, doesn't belong in your life." The condescension in his father's tone, "little music sessions," made Nate's jaw clench. But beneath the anger, he felt something else. Clarity. For the first time in his life, he could see his father clearly, not as the towering authority figure who'd shaped his every choice, but as a man afraid of anything that didn't fit his narrow definition of appropriate. "You're wrong," Nate said simply. "About Camille, about what I need, about everything. Elena wasn't perfect, no one is, but she was perfect for me because she challenged me to be better while accepting me as I was. Camille does the same thing, and the fact that she doesn't come from our world is precisely why she's good for me. She sees past the title and the reputation to the person underneath." "You're thinking with your emotions instead of your head," Edmund snapped. "This is exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making that what?" Nate stood his patience, finally exhausted. "That makes me human instead of a judicial robot. That suggests I might value personal happiness as much as professional reputation." "You're right, Father. I am thinking with my emotions. For the first time in 10 years, I'm allowing myself to feel something other than grief and obligation. And it's terrifying and wonderful, and I'm not going to apologize for it." Blind Edmund stood as well, his face flushed with anger. "If you continue down this path, you'll damage your credibility. Judges are supposed to be above reproach, above the messy entanglements of love," Nate interrupted. "Of human connection. Father, I've spent a decade being above reproach. I've been the ice judge, the widower, who never smiled, the legal mind, uncompromised by emotion. And it nearly killed me. Not literally, but in every way that matters. Camilla reminds me that I'm a person first and a judge second. That's not a weakness. It's what makes me capable of true justice, understanding that the people who come before my bench are human beings with messy, complicated lives. This conversation is pointless if you've already made up your mind to be reckless," Edmund said coldly. He moved toward the door, then paused. "When this relationship implodes, and it will, Nathaniel, they always do when there's such a fundamental mismatch, don't expect me to help you pick up the pieces of your reputation." "I won't," Nate said quietly, Because I'm finally learning to trust my own judgment instead of seeking your approval for every decision I make. After his father left, Nate sank back into his chair, adrenaline and emotion leaving him shaky. He'd just burned a bridge with the man whose approval had driven him his entire life. And instead of feeling devastated, he felt free. His phone buzzed. "Camille, how did it go with whatever crisis pulled you into late chambers work?" Nate smiled and typed back, "Not a crisis, a clarification. I'll tell you about it over dinner tomorrow. But Camille, I'm all in. Whatever this is between us, I'm choosing it. Choosing you. Choosing the possibility of us." Three dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then I'm all in too. And Nate, "I think we might be falling in love. Is that frightening or wonderful?" He stared at the message, his heart racing. Love. The word that had seemed impossible a month ago, forbidden for a decade. But sitting in his chambers with Elena's letter in his briefcase and his father's disapproval still hanging in the air, Nate realized that Camille was right. Both, he typed. It's both, and I can't wait. The hospital gala arrived with the kind of crisp winter elegance that Boston excelled at. Fresh snow had fallen that morning, coating the city in white, and the hotel where the event was being held glowed with warm light against the December darkness. Nate arrived early despite Morrison's amused suggestion that fashionable lateness might be appropriate. He wore his tuxedo with the kind of automatic precision that came from years of formal events, but his hands were shaking slightly as he waited in the hotel lobby for Camille to arrive. This was it, their public debut as a couple, the moment when Boston's medical and legal communities would see them together and draw their conclusions. He'd prepared himself for scrutiny, for judgment, for the inevitable comparisons to Elena. What he wasn't prepared for was the sight of Camille descending the hotel's grand staircase in a floor-length gown of midnight blue that made her look like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist, and she wore pearl earrings that caught the light with every movement. She was stunning, not despite her strength and intelligence, but because of it. This was a woman who knew exactly who she was and made no apologies for it. "You're staring," Camille said as she reached him, her smile both amused and pleased. "I'm admiring," Nate corrected, offering his arm. "You look absolutely beautiful." "You clean up pretty well yourself, Judge Ashford." She slipped her hand through his arm, the gesture intimate and natural. "Ready to face the gauntlet. With you, I'm ready for anything." The ballroom was already filling with Boston's medical elite hospital administrators, department heads, philanthropists, and the occasional politician looking to be seen supporting healthcare initiatives. Nate recognized several faces from various professional contexts, and he could feel the attention shift toward them as they entered together. The whispers started immediately, discreet but audible if you were listening for them. "Is that Judge Ashford? I didn't know he was dating anyone." "That's the music therapist from Children's Hospital. What's her name again?" "She's so young. How long has it been since his wife died?" Camille's hand tightened slightly on his arm, but her expression remained serene. "Breathe," she murmured. "They're just curious. We're the most interesting thing at a rubber chicken dinner. They'll move on to the next scandal by dessert." "You're remarkably calm about being gossip fodder," Nate observed. "I've been talked about before. It comes with being a woman in a male-dominated hospital hierarchy who dares to suggest that music might be as important as medication." She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and raised it slightly. "To surviving social scrutiny with our dignity intact." "To partnership," Nate countered, clinking his glass against hers. They were 3 sips into their champagne when Genevieve Lancaster materialized in front of them like a particularly well-dressed nightmare. She wore red blood red, and her smile had all the warmth of a prosecutorial cross-examination. "Nathaniel," she purred, her eyes sliding past him to Camille with barely disguised hostility. "How lovely to see you out and about. And Dr. Thorne, what a surprise to see you here. I didn't realize music therapists were invited to medical galas." "The invitation was for all children's hospital staff," Camille said evenly. "Music therapy is a legitimate medical intervention. We have research data to support our efficacy." "Of course you do." Genevieve's tone suggested she found the very concept laughable. "Nathaniel, might I speak with you privately for a moment about a legal matter?" "Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Dr. Thorne," Nate replied, his voice carrying the judicial authority that made attorneys straighten their spines in court. Genevieve's smile tightened. "Very well. I wanted to inform you that the U.S. Attorney's Office received your complaint about my conduct. We take such allegations seriously, of course, but I hope you understand that reaching out to Dr. Thorne about the insurance fraud case was entirely appropriate professional communication." Attempting to intimidate someone I'm seeing by implying that our relationship would subject her to scrutiny is not appropriate professional communication, Nate said quietly. It's harassment. And if it happens again, I won't stop at an internal complaint. I'll file a formal bar grievance. Such strong words. Genevieve's eyes glittered with something ugly. Be careful, Nathaniel. Judges who let their personal relationships compromise their professional judgment often find themselves subject to ethics investigations. It would be a shame if your brilliant career were derailed by an inappropriate romance. The only inappropriate thing happening here is your behavior. Camille said, her voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel that made both Nate and Genevieve look at her in surprise. I understand that you have history with Nate, and I'm sorry if our relationship is painful for you. But threatening him, threatening us, crosses a line from personal disappointment into professional misconduct. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk away from this conversation. You're going to stop using your position to intimidate either of us. And you're going to accept that Nate has moved on. Are we clear? For a moment, Genevieve looked like she might argue. Then something in Camille's unwavering gaze made her recalculate. She lifted her chin, managed a brittle smile, and turned on her heel without another word. Nate stared at Camille in amazement. That was partnership, Camille finished. You defended me to your father. I defend you to your ex-girlfriend. That's how this works. Before Nate could respond, a familiar voice called his name. He turned to find Beatrice Lowell, approaching resplendent in silver silk and looking pleased as a cat with cream. Nathaniel, Dr. Thorne, how wonderful to see you both. Together. Her emphasis on the last word was pointed and approving. I was hoping I'd have a chance to speak with you this evening. Beatrice. Nate accepted her embrace warmly. Thank you for your invitation to the concert. It changed my life. That was rather the point, dear boy. Beatrice's eyes sparkled with mischief. Elena asked me to look after you, but she was quite specific about what that meant. She didn't want me to let you wallow in grief forever. She wanted me to wait until you were ready and then give you a push toward living again. When Camille came to Boston and I heard her sing, I knew immediately. This was the push Elena had asked me to provide. Camille looked between Beatrice and Nate, understanding dawning in her expression. You orchestrated our meeting, deliberately. I facilitated an introduction between two people who desperately needed what the other could offer. Beatrice corrected. What you did with that introduction was entirely up to you, and I must say you've exceeded my expectations. You're good for each other. I can see it in how you stand together, how you speak to each other. That's partnership, not performance. Thank you, Nate said quietly, for seeing what I needed before I knew I needed it. That's what mentors are for. Beatrice patted his arm affectionately. Now I believe dinner is being served. Try the salmon, it's actually edible, which at these events counts as a minor miracle. And Nathaniel, stop worrying about what people think. Anyone worth knowing can see that you two are building something real. As they found their assigned seats mercifully at a table with friendly hospital staff rather than legal colleagues, Nate marveled at the evening's trajectory. They'd faced down Genevieve, received Beatrice's blessing, and survived the initial wave of gossip. And through it all, Camille had remained steady strong, exactly the partner he needed. Dinner was indeed edible, the speeches were mercifully brief, and by the time the dancing started, Nate felt himself relaxing into the evening. When Camille tugged him onto the dance floor for a slow waltz, he went willingly, pulling her close and marveling at how natural it felt to hold her in his arms. You know what I realized tonight, Camille said softly, her head resting against his shoulder as they swayed to the music. What's that? I'm falling in love with you, actually properly falling in love. The scary kind, where you start imagining futures and making plans and thinking about all the ways this could work instead of all the ways it could fail. Nate's heart stuttered in his chest. Love. The word Elena had given him permission to feel again. The emotion he'd thought was buried with her. I'm falling in love with you too. He admitted the words, feeling like confession and celebration all at once. And it terrifies me, Camille, because I know how much it hurts to lose someone you love. I know that loving you means giving you the power to destroy me. It also means trusting that we'll build something strong enough to weather whatever comes, Camille replied. Love is always a risk, Nate, but I think you're worth the risk. I think we're worth it. They danced through 2 more songs before Nate gently led Camille off the floor and toward the exit. He needed to show her something, needed to share the final piece of his past before they could fully step into their future. Outside in the quiet of his car, Nate retrieved Elena's letter from his briefcase and handed it to Camille. I want you to read this, he said. Elena wrote it before she died. I only opened it a few weeks ago after I met you. I think you should know what she wanted for me, for us. Camille read the letter slowly, her eyes filling with tears as she absorbed Elena's words. When she finished, she carefully refolded it and handed it back to Nate. "She sounds like she was extraordinary," Camille said softly. "And she loved you so much that she wanted you to love again. That's a gift, Nate. Not everyone is that generous." "She would have liked you," Nate said. "She would have appreciated your strength, your refusal to let me hide behind my grief. She would have recognized you as someone capable of being my equal partner." "I hope so." Camille took his hand, interlacing their fingers. "Because I want to honor her memory by loving you well, by being the partner she hoped you'd find, by proving that second chances at happiness aren't betrayals of first loves, but tributes to them." Nate pulled her close, kissing her with a depth of feeling that surprised them both. This wasn't the gentle, exploratory kiss of their first date. This was a declaration, a commitment, a promise of something real and lasting. When they finally pulled apart, Camille was smiling through her tears. "Take me home," she said. "Not to my apartment, to your home. I want to see where you live, who you are when you're not being the ice judge or the grieving widower. I want to see just Nate." Morrison had left a light on in the foyer when they arrived at the Ashford residence. The house was quiet, elegant, filled with the accumulated history of a family that had occupied these rooms for 3 generations. Nate gave Camille a tour showing her the library where he did most of his legal writing, the music room where Elena's violin still rested in its case, the kitchen where Morrison performed minor miracles of culinary competence, and finally his bedroom. He'd avoided this room with other visitors protective of its privacy. But with Camille, it felt natural to let her in, to let her see the space where he was most vulnerable. She stood in the doorway, taking in the simple elegance, the 4-poster bed, the reading chair by the window, the photographs on the dresser that showed glimpses of his life before grief had frozen it in place. "I want to stay," Camille said quietly. "Not just tonight, but increasingly. I want mornings with terrible coffee and evenings debating philosophy and nights falling asleep next to someone who understands that intimacy isn't just physical." "Is that too much, too fast?" "It's everything I want and everything that scares me," Nate admitted. "But I'm learning that the things worth having are usually the ones that terrify us. Stay, please stay." They made love that night with a tenderness that acknowledged both their vulnerability and their strength. Camilla was patient with Nate's rusty attempts at intimacy, guiding him with gentle humor. When he overthought things, meeting him with passion, when he finally let himself be present in the moment. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Nate felt something fundamental shift inside himself. This wasn't betrayal of Elena's memory. It was honoring it, proving that love was worth the risk, that knowing someone deeply was better than never knowing them at all. "Camille," he whispered into her hair as she drowsed against his chest. "Thank you for being patient with me, for seeing past all my defenses, for teaching me that healing isn't forgetting, it's learning to carry both the grief and the joy. Thank you for choosing to live again," she murmured sleepily, "for being brave enough to take the risk, for being my partner in every sense that matters." As Nate drifted towards sleep, he thought of Elena's letter of her command that he live fully and love completely. He thought of the decade he'd spent frozen, afraid to feel anything that might hurt him. And he thought of the woman sleeping in his arms who'd somehow thawed his frozen heart and reminded him that silence between notes was what made music beautiful. The judge who never smiled was smiling now. And for the first time in 10 years, Nathaniel Ashford fell asleep, not haunted by what he'd lost, but grateful for what he'd found. The symphony of his life was playing again, and this time he was ready to hear every note. January arrived in Boston with the kind of bitter cold that made even the hardiest New Englanders question their life choices. But inside the Ashford residence, warmth had taken up permanent residence. Camille had moved in gradually over the past month, a drawer of clothes one week, toiletries the next, until one morning Nate woke up and realized that her presence had transformed his house from a mausoleum of grief into an actual home. It was a Saturday morning in mid-January when Camille emerged from the bathroom looking pale and shaken, clutching a small white stick in her trembling hand. "Nate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." He looked up from the legal brief he'd been reviewing in bed, immediately alert to the strain in her voice. "What is it? What's wrong?" She sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the pregnancy test. "I'm pregnant." The words hit Nate like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at Camille's face and see Elena in the hospital bed, 8 months pregnant, smiling at him before they took her in for the surgery she would never wake up from. "Nate," Camille's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Say something, please." "I—" He tried to speak, but his throat had closed up. pregnant, a baby, the same situation that had killed Elena and their unborn child. I can't do this. I can't lose you too. I can't. He was hyperventilating now, panic overtaking rational thought. Camille set down the test and moved to kneel in front of him, taking his face in her hands with gentle firmness. Look at me, she commanded. Nate, look at me. I'm scared too. But we're not Elena, and you 10 years ago. We're us now with the best doctors and medical care in Boston. We're going to face this together, as partners. What if something goes wrong? The words came out choked. What if I lose you the way I lost her? What if everything goes right? Camille interrupted. What if we have a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby and we get to build the family that was taken from you before Nate? I need you to breathe. Can you do that for me? Just breathe. She counted with him in for 4 hold, for 4 out for 4, until the panic began to recede and rational thought returned. When he could finally speak again, Nate pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she gasped. I'm terrified, he whispered into her hair. More terrified than I've ever been in my life. I know, so am I. Camille's arms tightened around him. But Nate, we face this as partners. We get the best prenatal care. We attend every appointment together. We do everything possible to keep both me and the baby safe. And if you need therapy to work through the trauma of what happened to Elena, we'll get you that too. Therapy, Nate repeated the word, feeling strange in his mouth. He'd avoided counseling after Elena's death, couldn't bear to sit in a room and talk about feelings when every feeling threatened to destroy him. I think you might have PTSD from the accident, Camille said gently. And pregnancy is a massive trigger. There's no shame in getting professional help to process that, Nate. In fact, I think it's necessary if we're going to do this together. She was right. Of course she was right. Camille was always right about these things, seeing past his defenses to the wounds underneath. Okay, he said. Therapy, the best prenatal care, everything we can do to keep you safe. But Camille, if at any point you're in danger, if the doctors say there's a choice between you and the baby, we'll make that decision together when and if it comes to it, Camille interrupted firmly. We don't borrow trouble from hypothetical futures. We deal with what's in front of us one day at a time. Agreed. Agreed. Over the next 2 months, they established a routine built around Camille's pregnancy. Every appointment with the obstetrician, Nate was there asking questions with the same intensity he brought to complex legal cases. Every ultrasound, he held Camille's hand and stared at the grainy images of their growing child with a mixture of wonder and terror. And every Thursday evening, Nate attended therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah Levine, a psychologist who specialized in trauma and grief. At first, he'd been resistant, protective of his pain in the way that had become habitual. But Dr. Levine had a way of cutting through his defenses with questions that demanded honesty. Tell me about the night Elena died, she said during their 3rd session. Nate had never told anyone the full story, not Morrison, not his father, not even Camille. But sitting in Dr. Levine's quiet office, he found the words coming. We had a trial scheduled the next morning, a major corruption case, months of preparation. Elena was 8 months pregnant and wanted me to come home because a storm was forecast. But I said the trial was too important. I needed to be at the courthouse reviewing documents. I told her to drive in and meet me instead. And she agreed. She was scared of driving in bad weather, but she wanted to surprise me with dinner. So she got in the car, and halfway to the courthouse, the roads iced over. A truck jackknifed, couldn't stop. The paramedics said she died instantly, her and the baby both. And you blame yourself for that. I should have gone home. I should have postponed the trial. I should have put my pregnant wife's safety above my career. Dr. Levine was quiet for a moment. Nate, if Elena had stayed home and slipped on ice in your driveway and died, would you blame yourself for not having better traction mats? That's different. Is it, or is it just another example of you taking responsibility for things outside your control? Elena made a choice to drive. The weather made a choice to turn the roads to ice. The truck driver made choices that led to the accident. You made a choice to stay at work. All of those choices contributed to the outcome, but none of them individually caused it. Tragedy isn't usually the result of one person's decision. It's the convergence of multiple factors, most of which are random. So I should just accept that the universe is random and terrible things happen for no reason. I'm saying you should accept that you're not God, that you can't control every variable, that sometimes the best decisions still lead to the worst outcomes, and that doesn't make you responsible for the outcome. The sessions continued through February and into March. Slowly, painfully, Nate began to unpack the guilt he'd been carrying for a decade. And as he did, he found himself more able to be present for Camille's pregnancy, to feel joy alongside the fear. They found out the sex at the 20-week ultrasound, a girl. Camille wanted to name her Beatrice Elena Ashford, honoring both the mentor who'd brought them together and the wife who'd given Nate permission to love again. Are you sure? Nate asked. Naming her after Elena, that's not too much. It's perfect, Camille said firmly. Elena gave you back to the world. The least we can do is give her granddaughter her name. As Camille's pregnancy progressed, they began preparing the nursery together. The room that had been locked for 10 years, the one Elena had decorated in soft yellows and greens, filled with baby clothes she'd never get to use, was finally opened. It was painful at first. Every tiny outfit felt like a ghost of the future that had been stolen. But Camille approached it with characteristic directness. We can donate these to the children's hospital, she said gently, folding a miniature onesie. Some other baby can use them. That's not erasing Elena's memory. It's honoring it by making sure her preparations help someone. They repainted the room in soft lavender, set up a crib and changing table, filled the bookshelf with children's books that Nate read aloud to Camille's growing belly, feeling absurd and wonderful at the same time. She can hear you, Camille said one evening, her hand over his as he pressed his palm to her stomach. The books say babies can recognize voices from inside the womb. Then she's going to be very familiar with case law and legal precedent, Nate joked. I've been reading her my sentencing opinions. You have not. I absolutely have. If she's going to be the daughter of a federal judge, she might as well get used to constitutional analysis early. Camille's laugh filled the nursery, and Nate marveled at how this room that had been a shrine to grief was now being transformed into a space of hope. But as Camille entered her third trimester, Nate's anxiety increased. Every twinge, every unusual symptom sent him into a spiral of worry. He became hypervigilant, monitoring her constantly to the point where Camille finally put her foot down. Nate, I love you, but you need to stop hovering. I'm pregnant, not dying. My blood pressure is perfect, the baby is healthy, and Dr. Martinez says everything is progressing normally. I know, but no buts. We talked about this in therapy. You can't control every variable. You can't protect me from random chance by watching me like a hawk. All you're doing is making yourself crazy and making me feel like a ticking time bomb. She was right, of course. Dr. Levine had said the same thing in their last session. Nate's hypervigilance was his attempt to avoid feeling helpless, but it was ultimately counterproductive. I'm sorry, he said. I just keep thinking about what happened to Elena, and I can't shake the fear that history will repeat itself. History isn't repeating, we're writing a new story. And yes, something could go wrong. Car accidents happen, medical complications occur. The universe is random and scary. But Nate, if we spend the next 2 months paralyzed by what ifs, we'll miss the actual joy of preparing to meet our daughter. Is that what you want? No, I want to be present. I want to be the partner you deserve, not a bundle of anxiety. Then trust me. Trust the doctors. Trust that we're doing everything right and that sometimes doing everything right is all we can do. March gave way to April, and Boston began its reluctant thaw. Camille's due date was April 15th, ironically the same date that had been on Margaret Lowell's imaginary will condition in the outline that was never used. But this April 15th would be about life, not legal deadlines. On April 12th, 3 days before the due date, Boston was hit with a late-season snowstorm. Nate was in his chambers when Camille called. Don't panic, she said, which immediately made him in panic. But I think I'm in labor. My water just broke. Everything that happened next felt like it was happening both in slow motion and at triple speed. Nate's car service rushing through increasingly heavy snow, his hands white-knuckled on his phone as he called Dr. Martinez. The drive to Mass General that should have taken 15 minutes but took 30 as the roads iced over. And the entire time all he could think was, not again. Please God, not again. When they arrived at the hospital, Camilo was already in a delivery room hooked up to monitors that showed a strong, steady heartbeat from the baby. Dr. Martinez was there, calm and competent. Everything looks good, the obstetrician said. Labor is progressing normally. Should be a few hours yet, but both mom and baby are doing great. Nate wanted to believe her, but as the hours passed and the snow continued to fall outside the hospital windows, he found himself spiraling. This was too much like 10 years ago. The snow, the hospital, the monitors beeping. Any moment now something would go wrong. The baby would be in distress. Camille would need emergency surgery. He would lose everything again. Nate, Camille's hand gripped his, pulling him out of his spiral. I need you here with me, not lost in your memories of Elena. Here now with me. I'm sorry, I just keep seeing. I know what you're seeing, but look at me. Really look at me. I'm here. I'm fine. Our daughter is fine. We're going to get through this together. Her certainty grounded him. This was Camille, not Elena. This was now not 10 years ago. He could choose to be present, to trust in the skilled medical team surrounding them, to believe that sometimes things did go right. Labor progressed through the evening. Camille was incredible, focused and strong, breathing through contractions with the same discipline she brought to her music. Nate stayed by her side, holding her hand, letting her squeeze until his fingers went numb. And at 11:47 p.m. on April 12, 2025, Beatrice Elena Ashford entered the world with a cry that was the most beautiful sound Nate had ever heard. Dr. Martinez placed the baby on Camille's chest, and Nate felt something in him break open, not with grief this time, but with joy so profound it hurt. His daughter, their daughter, healthy and whole and absolutely perfect. She has your nose, Camille said through tears, looking down at the tiny face against her skin. And my eyes, I think. Oh, Nate, she's perfect. You're perfect, Nate managed, his voice choked with emotion. Both of you. You did it, Camille. You're incredible. He cut the umbilical cord with shaking hands, then just stood there watching as the nurses cleaned and weighed and assessed the baby. 8 pounds, 2 ounces, all 10 fingers and toes accounted for. Apgar scores perfect. When they finally handed Beatrice to him, wrapped in a hospital blanket and making small snuffling sounds, Nate felt his heart expand in ways he hadn't known were possible. This tiny person was depending on him, trusting him, offering him a second chance at fatherhood that he'd thought was lost forever. Hello, little one, he whispered, his tears falling onto the blanket. I'm your father, and I promise I'm going to be aiming to do better this time. I'm going to be present for every moment. Every first word and first step and first heartbreak. You're not going to grow up with a ghost for a father. I promise you that. Camille watched him with eyes full of love. She's lucky to have you. We both are. That night, after Camille had fallen asleep exhausted and Beatrice was contentedly nursing, Nate sat in the hospital room's uncomfortable chair and thought about the journey that had brought him here. 10 years of grief, a decade of being frozen. And then Camille singing Handel at a charity concert, her voice somehow reaching through all his defenses to remind him what it felt like to be alive. He thought about Elena's letter still kept safe in his desk drawer at home. Find someone and love them completely, she'd written. That's not betrayal. That's the legacy I want to leave. Looking at his newborn daughter and his sleeping wife, Nate realized that Elena had been right about everything. Loving again hadn't dishonored her memory. It had honored it by proving that love was worth the risk of loss. That knowing someone deeply, even if you lost them, was better than never knowing them at all. And now he had Beatrice. A living legacy of second chances, of healing, of the truth that grief and joy could coexist in the same heart. The snowstorm that had terrified him on the drive to the hospital, it had passed. The sun was beginning to rise over Boston, painting the snow-covered city in shades of pink and gold. A new day, a new beginning. A family built not on forgetting the past, but on honoring it while choosing to live fully in the present. The man who had forgotten how to smile was cradling his daughter, his face wet with tears of joy, finally understanding what it meant to be healed. 2 years later, October 2027, Boston. The Music Therapy Center was everything Camille had dreamed it would be. Housed in a renovated brownstone in Jamaica Plain, the Beatrice Elena Lowell Center for Music Therapy served over 500 clients a year. Veterans dealing with PTSD, abuse survivors, finding their voices, grieving families, learning to speak the unspeakable. Nate had provided the initial funding, but Camille had secured additional grants that allowed them to offer sliding scale fees and even free services to those who couldn't afford them. It had become her life's work, the place where her gifts as a therapist and her training as a musician came together in service of healing. On this particular October afternoon, the center was celebrating Beatrice's second birthday. The rooms were filled with families they'd worked with over the years. The 7-year-old boy who'd finally spoken after his father's death, now 8 and playing piano with surprising skill. The teenager who'd survived sexual assault and found her voice again through singing. The elderly widower who'd learned to process his grief through drumming circles. And in the center of it all, Beatrice herself, a precocious 2-year-old with Nate's dark hair and Camille's warm brown eyes, conducting an imaginary orchestra with a wooden spoon while her parents looked on with besotted pride. She's going to be a handful, Morrison observed, watching as Beatrice directed a group of therapy clients in an enthusiastic rendition of Happy Birthday. The butler had become an honorary grandfather to the little girl, spoiling her shamelessly while maintaining his professional dignity. She already is a handful, Nate said, but his smile was so wide it hurt. Last week, she reorganized my legal briefs by color instead of relevance. Apparently, justice should be more aesthetically pleasing. She has a point, Camille said, slipping her hand into Nate's. Everything's better with proper color coordination. Beatrice Lowell appeared at Nate's elbow, now well into her 80s, but still sharp as a tack. Your daughter is extraordinary, she said, watching little Beatrice with obvious affection. Musical, strong-willed, completely fearless. She's going to change the world. She already has, Nate said quietly. Just by existing. Later, after the party had wound down and most of the guests had departed, Beatrice Sr. pulled Nate aside. I have something for you, she said, retrieving an envelope from her purse. Margaret, little Beatrice's namesake. She left instructions that this was to be given to you on the child's second birthday. Nate took the envelope with trembling hands. It was addressed in handwriting he didn't recognize to Nathaniel and Camille on their daughter's second birthday. She planned this, Nate asked. Margaret planned for this specific moment. Margaret was many things, but short-sighted was not one of them. Beatrice's smile was enigmatic. Read it together, I think you'll understand. That evening, after Beatrice was asleep in her crib, still clutching the wooden spoon from her conducting performance, Nate and Camille sat in the living room and opened the letter together. Dear Nathaniel and Camille, if you're reading this, then several things have happened. You've met with Beatrice Lowell's not-so-subtle assistance. You've fallen in love. You've married, and you've welcomed a child likely named after people you've loved and lost because that's what people like you do. You honor the past while building the future. I never met either of you, but Beatrice told me enough about you both that I felt confident in my assessment. Nathaniel, a brilliant judge trapped in grief, unable to see beyond his own pain. Camille, a gifted therapist, afraid to claim her own joy because she'd spent so much time carrying other people's burdens. You needed each other. Not to fix each other, no one person can fix another, but to remind each other that healing is possible, that love after loss isn't betrayal, that joy and grief can coexist in the same heart. I was a contracts professor for 30 years. I understood the law better than I understood people. But at the end of my life, facing death with whatever grace I could muster, I realized that the only contracts that truly matter are the ones we make with each other in love. The promise to show up, to be present, to choose each other again and again, especially when it's hard. You have a child now. That's the ultimate act of hope in a random and often cruel universe. Every parent is saying, I believe the future will be worth living in. I believe love is stronger than fear. I believe in second chances and new beginnings and the possibility that broken things can be repaired. Raise that child, my namesake, perhaps, or Elena's, or both, to understand that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites. That music and science and art and law are all different languages for the same truth that we're here to take care of each other, to build beauty in the face of chaos, to choose hope when despair would be easier. And when your daughter asks about her family, and she will because children always do tell her this, she came from love. Not just the love between her parents, but a whole network of love that stretches back through generations. Elena's love for Nathaniel that was so strong, she gave him permission to love again. Margaret's love for both of you that brought you together. Beatrice's love for her students that created spaces for healing. Your daughter is the inheritor of all that love. The living proof that tragedy doesn't get the final word. That even in a universe that can be random and terrible, people still choose each other, still create families, still believe that tomorrow will be worth seeing. I won't be there to meet her. That's the one regret of dying, all the tomorrows I won't experience, all the people I won't meet, all the love I won't witness. But I'm glad knowing she exists, this child born from grief, transformed into joy, from frozen hearts, learning to thaw, from the silence between notes becoming music again. Love each other well, raise her strong, and remember the best way to honor the dead is to live fully. With all my hope for your beautiful future, Margaret Lowell. They read the letter twice, then sat in silence, holding hands and crying. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of being seen, being known, being part of something larger than themselves. She was right about everything, Camille finally said. We did need each other, not to fix, but to remind. And we named our daughter after both of them, Nate added, looking toward the nursery where Beatrice slept. Beatrice Elena. The mentor who brought us together and the wife who gave me permission to love again. We should add this letter to the box, Camille said. They'd started a collection for Beatrice letters, photos, mementos, that would help her understand where she came from. Elena's letter to Nate, the program from Camille's first concert at the Lowell Foundation, their wedding invitation. And now this. That night, standing in the nursery watching their daughter sleep, Nate reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the frozen judge who couldn't smile to the man who woke up every morning grateful for the chaos and joy of family life. "What are you thinking?" Camille whispered, slipping her arm around his waist. "That I spent 10 years convinced that loving again would dishonor Elena's memory. And it turns out the opposite was true. Loving you, building this family, creating the center, all of it honors her by proving that love is worth the risk. That the capacity to love deeply isn't diminished by loss, it's expanded by it." "She'd be proud of you," Camille said. "Of us. Of what we've built. I think she'd be proud of you especially. You took a broken man and taught him how to live again. That's a kind of magic. You were never broken, Nate. You were grieving. There's a difference." Camille turned to face him, her hands cupping his face. "And you taught me something too, that it's okay to claim joy for myself, not just facilitate it for others. That being a therapist doesn't mean I can't also be a wife and mother who needs care as much as she gives it." They stood in the soft glow of the nightlight, watching their daughter sleep, marveling at the miracle of second chances. "You know what the best part is?" Nate whispered. "What?" The silence between notes. The pause between heartbeats. The space where grief and joy meet and learn to coexist. That's where the real music happens. Camille smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "The music therapist in me very much approves of that metaphor. I thought you might." As they stood together in their daughter's nursery, Nathaniel Ashford realized that he'd finally learned the lesson Elena had tried to teach him in her letter. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant expanding your capacity to hold multiple truths at once, that you could mourn what was lost while celebrating what was found, that you could honor the past while building the future. That love once learned never truly disappeared. It just transformed, adapted, grew to encompass new people and new possibilities. The man who had forgotten how to smile was smiling now. Not because he'd moved on from grief, but because he'd learned to carry it alongside joy, the two emotions woven together like harmonies in a song. And sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, Nate would swear he could hear music, Elena's violin playing somewhere in the distance, not mournful but celebratory, as if she too was smiling at the family he'd built, the love he'd found, the life he'd chosen despite his fear. The silence between notes was where the most beautiful music began. And the symphony of the Ashford family was still playing, each day a new movement, each moment a gift to be savored rather than endured. The judge who never smiled had finally learned love doesn't end with death. It transforms. It endures. It teaches us that even in a random and sometimes cruel universe, choosing to love is the most courageous and meaningful act we can perform. And that legacy, that truth was the greatest gift he could give his daughter. The music played on.